actually asking a question. So the recording has now begun, and my name is Jacqueline Dutton. I'm president of the Australian Association for Literary Translation, known as AALITRA. On behalf of the AALITRA committee, I would like to welcome you all most warmly to the 2021 AALITRA Symposium on Writing, Translating and Publishing, Literary Translation in Australia. Now, this event was to have been a very convivial event at the Multicultural Hub in Melbourne, but due to COVID lockdown, we have had to pivot to an online forum. We've done our very best to ensure that it will be a very convivial event online via Zoom, and I'm sure many of you know how to manage the protocols of Zoom. So if you have anything that you want to say, please raise your hand using the reactions button, which is on the bottom right hand of the panel below the images. And if you want to mention anything, please put that into the chat. So I would like to acknowledge that for all of us who are connecting into this symposium from the island continent known as Australia, we are all on lands that were never ceded. I'm speaking to you today from Bunurong country, and I'm grateful to the Bunurong elders past, present and emerging for the care and love they have for their country and the knowledge of nature, science, culture and language that they have shared with us. Elders like Nawit, Dr. Carolyn Briggs and Auntie Faye Stewart Muir and many others have participated in initiatives to rekindle the Bunurong language and are striving to help keep Indigenous languages part of the precious living culture of the Kulin Nation. Now, the many translators that we have with us today will understand the importance of language as culture. And at AALITRA, we appreciate and want to promote the work that you do with potential publishers as well as with the wider general public. I say you translators because, in fact, I must confess up front that I am not a practicing translator. I am a passionate advocate of literary translation in all its forms: fictional, non-fictional, texts, tracts, all sorts of different types of literary translation, I think, need to be supported within our community. And I am very willing and energetic in my promotion of literary translation in Australia. But what we wanted to do in this symposium is to promote those points of access which are our publishers as well. So we are so fortunate to have with us here represented today Text Publishing, Black Ink Publishing, Giramondo Publishing, and we have the generous participation also of Cordite Publishing. So we are very, very pleased that we can promote the publishers who are promoting literary translation in Australia and Australian literary translators, or literary translators based in Australia, perhaps I should say. Now, throughout the symposium today, we'll also be putting links in the chat which will allow you to purchase books, to understand more about where you can locate these books and who is publishing and translating and writing about translation in Australia. So we hope that if you also have sources, that you will also be able to put those into the chat today as well. Now, part of our initiative to promote literary translators and literary translations in Australia, we would like to launch unofficially today the AALITRA online database of literary translators. We've developed a Google form so that you can begin to enter your information if you are a literary translator working in Australia. And if you are a member of AALITRA, this association has very low membership fees, and we hope that we will be able to really perform a beneficial function for our members by promoting their talents and the languages in which they are translating on the AALITRA website. So we are gathering information at the moment from our members who are literary translators, and we are looking forward to building a database that publishers will be able to consult, as well as members of the general public, in order to find out more about the ways in which we can promote translation in Australia today. I wonder if I might just pause for a moment here and ask whether there are any questions at this stage. And please feel free to either ask your question, raising your hand, your electronic hand, or pop your question in the Zoom chat. Everything okay for the moment? All right. I think we're running early, which is a fabulous way to start a symposium. So without further ado, I will now take up the great honour that I have to introduce the presenter of our opening address for the 2020 AALITRA Symposium on Writing, Translating and Publishing. She is one of Australia's most renowned editors and translators of French. Penny Houston is co-owner with Michael Hayward of Text Publishing, and also one of Australia's best known translators from French to English. Penny's translations from French include novels by Emmanuel Pagano, One Day I'll Tell You Everything, Nobel Prize winner Patrick Modiano, his book Little Jewel, Sarah Cohen-Scarley's book Max, and Raphael Jerusalemi text Evacuation. She has translated 6 books by Marie Darrieussecq. I'm a huge fan of Marie Darrieussecq, and I am so delighted that Penny has made her wonderful writing available to so many in the English-speaking world. She's translated All the Way, Men, Being Here, The Life of Paula Modersohn-Becker, and Our Life in the Forest, and The Baby and Cross Lines. It's an incredible list of translations, and of course, you can't do that many incredible translations without being shortlisted for pretty much every translation prize that we have in Australia. The JQ Wingate Prize, Penny's been shortlisted for the JQ Wingate Prize, the Scott Moncrieff Prize, and twice for the New South Wales Premier's Translation Prize. She was the winner in 2020 of the prestigious Australian Academy of the Humanities 2020 Medal for Excellence in Translation. So I could go on with the accolades for Penny Houston, but I think we all want to hear from her from both the perspective of the publisher and also from the translator and editor. Without further ado, please raise or put your hands together, or put a clap in the reactions for Penny Houston. Thank you so much, Penny, for coming along today, and we are looking forward to your wonderful opening address. Thank you so much. Over to you, Penny.
Thank you very much, Jackie. It's great to be here. Congratulations on the launch, unofficial or official, of the database. I think it's a wonderful initiative, another great initiative from AALITRA. It's great to see so many translators here today, especially the AALITRA ones, Bridget and Elizabeth and Lilith, Stephanie, Tiffany. I'm really excited. I think we need more books from Indonesia, so I'm just putting that out there. Welcome to all the students of translation. I think that's really exciting, and fellow publishers. We're all in this together, as tough as it is. We all want to read more writing from different languages and different places, and there is an overrepresentation of, as we all know, of English language texts at the expense of literature and translation in all English-speaking countries. So I think in Australia, we want not only international languages, but also those languages spoken and read in Australia. That's why I was very excited to see and commend the focus that Nadia Ziaz's Australian Multilingual Writing Project and the extraordinary number of languages that I read that Nadia is familiar with. Bravo. We need a lot more translations from our local multicultural writers. And I'm actually editing a South Sudanese memoir, a young woman, and I asked her, I said, what about from the community here in Australia? Have you got any Dinka and Swahili writers? And she's on the lookout. She's going to send me some things. So I think that kind of work is really important. And of course, we need to focus on the translations, as Jackie said, of writing by First Nations people. And I know there are terrific programs for this. So decolonising literature, reducing the dominance of English language, source language. But then, yeah, the complex question of who chooses what is and what isn't translated and published. So I will just talk about, from my perspective, a text, and we're a team, we all are on the lookout. It's not just me. And I've been asked to speak particularly about acquiring and selling rights. I'm more on the acquiring side than the selling side, but I'm also involved in that as well. But one of the great ways of buying and selling rights is going to book fairs. Sadly, that hasn't been the case over the last few years. So right now, everybody's heading to Frankfurt, except Australians. Well, not everybody, but it is the Frankfurt Book Fair right now. It's virtual for many of us. So I've got lots of Zooms. Normally editors, rights people, I mean, I'm talking about this for those who don't know, maybe the students, what a book fair is like. You go to Frankfurt, London, Taipei, Jerusalem. There's a whole range of book fairs throughout the year. Not that I go to all of them, but it's a great place to exchange ideas, manuscripts. Editors sometimes end up, staying up all night reading the hot manuscript that's going around, and you want to preempt to get the rights. And it's really exciting for books in translation. I found, an Israeli writer through just sitting with a Danish friend, having coffee with her Israeli writer, and then we ended up, well, it was a long story, but it had been, a translation had been commissioned by Knopf actually in the US, and they had ended up not liking the translation and doing what we never do, cancelling the translation. And so we sort of picked up the rights. But if I hadn't been sitting there having coffee in Jerusalem, it wouldn't have got the book. So it's really exciting. You bump into people, you discover books, and sometimes you have the hot book, and then it's really great to sell the rights to that book. And there are always translation workshops now, which is really exciting, or pitching sessions. So in Hungary, I remember it was a great pitching session. Even if you don't pick up a writer, you network, you make connections, and then down the track, you might find something. So, but before a fair, which has been the last few weeks, you're reading mountains of as well as translating Marie Dariussec's latest book on insomnia, reading lots of submissions from overseas publishers and agents. So I'm lucky enough to be able to read French, obviously, and Italian, a bit of Spanish and German, but otherwise the way we do it is we receive sample translations, and then you have to decide based on a synopsis and maybe some publishing gossip, and maybe you commission a report, whether you take the plunge, take the risk to acquire the rights. And sometimes I'm lucky enough, there is a French translation of a book. For example, I acquired Yan Lianqi, this wonderful Chinese writer, by reading there's a great French publisher, Edition Piquier, who published a lot of Asian writers, so I could read the French, and then acquired him years ago through reading the French translation. But it's a really great way to acquire books. So for budding translators, always do your very best sample. The other way is reading rights lists from agents as well, and the role of agents is of course really important in buying rights. They go out and find writers, and then they submit to publishers. So more and more agents are now selling translation rights. Text, like I'm sure every other publishers in Australia, we always prefer to buy world English rights, because then we can recoup some of the cost of the translation, the printing and the allied costs by selling the rights to the UK and the US. It makes a huge difference to the bottom line. But there are many permutations and combinations of either we often work with other small publishers like New Directions or Fitzcarraldo in the UK, or and other stories, and we'll split the rights if the agent allows it. Many times, as other publishers will know, Australia misses out because the old colonial system, the British publisher won't split the rights, the agent won't split the rights. Anyway, I won't go into the internecine battles we suffer about rights deals, but it's really nice. So by some weird circumstances, I've been reading a lot of Italian manuscripts lately, and there was one a few weeks ago. I stayed up really late and I thought, oh, this is so fantastic, I want to preempt it, and then I talked to my partner, who happens to be the publisher, and it's like, no, you need to finish the manuscript, and and I was like, no, I just know it's better than Ferrante, it's great. And anyway, I stayed up really late, and then I woke up in the morning and to open my email, and it had been preempted by Harper Via in the US. So I had the right instinct, but I didn't get to preempt it. But of course, I mean, my instinct was proven right, but we would never have preempted to the same amount of money as Harper Via in the US. So obviously, but anyway, it's exciting and interesting. But I bought the next one, another Italian manuscript, but from another agent. So yeah, it's agents, and then there's the foreign rights people from the different publishing companies who also submit all their lists, and there's a lot of lists to go through. It's kind of it's exhausting and exciting. And then there are the word of mouth recommendations, the networks you build up over the years. You keep up with other publishers. There are blogs that you probably all know about. Susan Bonovsky does a really good one, Porter Anderson in Publishing Perspectives. There's the English Pen website and their magazine Transmissions, the online magazine. And they are always running campaigns and prizes and events, and they're really proactive. And Asymptote, the magazine, I'm probably speaking to the converted, but other literary journals and 3%. But there are just, I don't know, when we used to be able to travel, I just was at a drinks party at the New Directions office, and the publisher had quite a few drinks, and she was just sort of ranting about all the books, and then she leant across and said, "Oh, Penny, you must read this." And there was a printout of a manuscript, and I remember the elastic band broke and I didn't get the whole thing, but she thrust some pages at me, and I was like, "Oh, okay, sure." And I went back, and that night, read this bunch of drink-spattered pages, and that was Eka Kurniawan's manuscript from Indonesia. And so we bought the ANZ rights for that because she was so enthusiastic, and Barbara Epler had got that because she was a judge on the Penn Translation Prize. So it's if I hadn't got to go to that drinks party, I wouldn't have got the manuscripts because they're a non-for-profit and less sort of out. Well, yeah, selling rights is a different thing for them, whereas for we're not subsidized, and we need selling rights is an important part of our financial operation, really. So that was a great way of acquiring a book, but also go through new releases and translators' websites and see samples. And then there are the publications that you probably all know about: new books in German, new books in Spanish, or Granter's Best of Writing. But I mean, there are just different ways of finding it out. There's no process as such, but yeah, like you never really know. Fernanda Melchor's, she's a great Mexican writer. We bought ANZ there, and her rights are through a Berlin-based publishing house, so who specialises in Spanish and German rights. So interesting. There are always different ways of acquiring rights, or translators submit direct, which is a really great way, and I would encourage that, even though it seems like a long shot. But I'm flat out, I can't read everything, and if you translators discover a book and you want to do a sample translation, make it really good, and write a summary, publishing rationale, pitch it to editors and publishers. It's go for it. I think it's really important. I think it's asked to provide, some statistics. Statistics are difficult because BookScan, the sales tracking data that we use in publishing, doesn't separate out books in translation, so it's sort of hard to track sales in Australia. But our list is about 16% in translation, about 14% of our books in translation since 2017 have been translated by Australian translators, mostly fiction, but some non-fiction. So Elizabeth Badinter, Yan Yankee, Yali Wu, Paula Morrison-Becker's book, Svetlana Alexievich, Liao Yu, The Corpse Walker, a couple of, a few more translation of non-fiction titles. Obviously, our percentage should be higher, but it is a lot higher than a lot of big trade publishers in the US and the UK. We're doing our best. Best-selling authors at Text have been Eleanor Ferrante, Niccolo Amaniti, Carlos Ruiz Zafón, Christelle Dabos, who's a YA French writer who's done really well. Linkfest, Olga Tokarczuk, obviously, Herman Koch, The Dinner. So we've published about 150 books in translation in print right now on our list. I've sort of pulled together quite a few stats, which I'll just gloss over, but on average, every year we would publish maybe like 13, 14 translations, maybe 2-3 Australian translators. The languages we've published in are Italian, Swedish, French, Arabic, German, Chinese, both mainland and Taiwan, Mandarin and Taiwanese, Spanish, Danish, Dutch, Polish, Korean, Indonesian, Hungarian, Hebrew, Yiddish, Russian, Albanian, Finnish, Catalan, and Norwegian. Although the Albanian story, I have to say, is a different one because Ismail Kadare, who's a great writer, we published, but he was translated by famous translator David Bellos from the French because there wasn't a really good Albanian writer, translator at the time. So that's an interesting one. It shouldn't really happen, but it's sort of like if you want to gig as a translator, it's like getting into an orchestra. I think, learn Albanian or learn the viola, because then you're going to get into the orchestra because there's not very many viola players. But okay, so selling rights overseas to overseas publishers of translation of Australian books, we've done pretty well over the years in selling rights. So since the beginning of 2011, Text has made over 500 rights sales across about 300 titles. It was great. Promise Me You'll Shoot Yourself by Florian Huber, a German book, which we found through a translator, Imogen Taylor, who also is a reader, sort of like a spotter of German literature for us. And we sold that into a lot of territories overseas. Initially, we bought world excluding Germany, so that's a great way of helping your bottom line. So Little Brown in North America, Rizzoli, Denmark, Penguin Random House, so Spain, a lot of territories. And another one was Fear by Dirk Kirbyveit. We sold into 17 territories. I bought a Korean book, The Plotters, where we bought world English. So there are just different rights that you can acquire, and the more rights that you can sell, the better, obviously. I'll skip over some more examples, but we work with agents in the UK and the US. So we have Lutyens and Rubenstein in the UK. They're very dear friends and very great agents, and we pitch our books to them. Then they, of course, have got all the personal contacts with all the editors who come and go in the local publishing companies in the UK. And in the US, we work with Inkwell, and likewise, when we're able to go to fairs, we obviously meet with them, and we also meet with the editors, but they have a lot of they cultivate the relationships over there. Timing is tricky. It's obviously easier to sell rights to non-English language markets because a different exercise altogether, whereas the US and the UK, they don't want to publish after us here. So we need to, time our publication so that they can see a full translation, which is pretty respectable. I mean, it's quite a tricky, because otherwise they won't buy the rights if we're going to be publishing before them. So it's a tricky process. So examples of authors who also sell very well overseas. We've had Graham Simpson selling into 44 territories. That's the Rosie Project. Kate Grenville, Gary Disher, Crime, which is Crime does well everywhere. And Peter Temple, and YA middle grade books. That's a difficult. Well, it's not difficult. It's when it works, it's really good, but it's slightly more affected by market fluctuations, I think. So you go to a book fair and one year it's like, oh, we only want to publish dystopian books. And then the next year you go back, no more dystopian books, or we only want to publish series. Oh my God, not another series. And you kind of, we've done well selling rights to our books in a lot of languages in YA middle grade, but right now it's, graphic novels. So maybe in a few years that will, who knows. But of course, these days with COVID, the market, I think for everyone has probably shrunk, well, considerably. Overseas editors are also seem to be looking for more local authors, local projects, particularly with, race issues. Yeah, I mean, my own translations, we've sold, to Semiotext in the US, the Yale University Press. They've got a great Margellis World Republic of Letters dedicated to translation. Sold Max to Scholastic UK, and if we don't manage to sell the rights to the US and the UK, we have our own publishing operation in the US and the UK, so we can distribute, publicize and market there as well if we choose to. Sometimes we've hired people on the ground, for specific projects. I think somebody else is talking about funding, but that is a really thorny issue. I mean, most books in publishing don't earn out, but if they, it's sort of like you get your bestsellers to support the ones that don't earn out, and if you're passionate about it, somehow you get over the line. Or if you get a school educational setting, that's like Niccolo Amaniti's book, I'm Not Scared, 25 years later is still on an educational setting. I mean, either we're talking about a lack of initiative by the teachers, or it's just no, it is actually a really great book. It's timeless, it's wonderful, but we're very grateful for that. I mean, we always budget to at least break even, but it doesn't always happen. Or you get grants from, which we have received from targeted funding from the Australia Council Copyright Agency. And we've also received grants from the Goethe Institute, the Literature Translation Institute of Korea, the Ministry of Culture in Taiwan, the Centre National du Livre. I mean, we don't have in Australia that sort of rich culture of endowments and non-for-profit publishers that is in the US, for example, but somehow we just keep going. And I mean, the grants from governments are really competitive too. So the process, once, I think I was to talk about the process as well, but I'm not sure how much time I've got, but once you acquire the translation, so I'm working as an editor, then I can be working on the translation and with the translator, or you can end up working with, if you've split the rights with 3 different translators, 3 different editors in other territories, you end up with a track change document that's really pretty heavy. And sometimes the agent presumes that, they're really good at this too. So you'll have the agent's comments, and then you might have the writer who, sometimes the writer's partner puts their track changes on, which I've recently experienced, because they also think that they're experts in English. And it's quite a diplomatic exercise, the editorial process in translation. I mean, sometimes it's really easy and sometimes it's really complicated. And it varies for each manuscript. And I mean, sometimes you're actually editing the original script, because a lot of overseas publishers don't edit their manuscripts before, I mean, surprising as it seems, before they publish them. So you'll say, well, hey, this is a repetition from that. Oh, right. Yep, that's fine. Cut that. But, you know, I mean, it's a different book published in English in the end. But yeah, it's really about making sure it, you know, in the process that it reads well in English, and that's the main issue. And sometimes editing, you know, can for me seems like it's harder than editing. A translation can be harder than actually translating, but because you've got to, what did the translator think that the author meant, and what did the author mean, and what, you know, what's the alternative. But it's a really it's fun, it's good, and you become an expert in all sorts of topics in order to get the translation right. And like I just bought a book, with set in Sardinia, so there's the Sardo, there's the dialects, there's, you know, I learned a lot about Basque dialect working with Marie Dariusek, who's Basque and comes from the Basque country. And I think that, you wanted to find out a bit about promotion, marketing and publicity. So promoting translated works is becoming increasingly challenging, I think, in Australia due to the lack of media space and inclination post-COVID. Now I think we're favouring local authors for review coverage. There's just not as much space. But that said, there is an appetite, particularly at writers' festivals, for international voices, especially those talking about issues around race and gender. So we do find that we're able to get festival invitations for writers who are comfortable to talk about their work in English or via an interpreter. Fernanda Melchor we had last year talking at the Wheeler Centre, and that was a really great session. We found great success with a number of translated authors who've found new followings here. And there's a push at the moment to platform new voices in literary criticism. So I think we can expect that as traditional media start to commission reviews from a new generation of critics from more diverse backgrounds, which I think is fantastic, then media coverage of books in translation will be easier to find. But yeah, if the writer doesn't speak English and there isn't an interpreter, it is like, how do you do a publicity campaign for a book without an author? But, you know, it's possible, it's fine, but or you have, as Jane Sullivan mentioned this morning, you know, we brought out Anne Goldstein, and she was the voice of Elena Ferrante. I mean, it's kind of weird, but and I guess maybe the name of the translator on the cover of the book, there is this controversy at the moment, started with by Jennifer Croft, and I think it's really important. She's raised a really important issue. Fortunately, over the last few years, we have made it a policy at Text, and we do have the translator's name on the cover of every book. So that's kind of basic way of promoting translation. So I've skated over a lot of different topics. So maybe if you want to ask me some questions about, I didn't know whether I was speaking to the converted or whether the students needed to have a bit of more of an introduction, but yeah, fire away.
That's amazing, Penny. Thank you so much for giving us this incredible overview of the translation industry from your perspective as a publisher, editor, translator yourself. I'd really like to ask some questions about your own translating experience as well. But we are, of course, talking about writing, translating and publishing in this forum today. I'm really interested in getting your insights into this area. I'm so glad we're recording this, because everyone can go back to revise over a lot of the wonderful information that you've provided already. So thank you so much, Penny. It's fantastic already.
Can I ask a question, please?
Jakob, can you please just wait? Because
Right.
we've just, if you can raise your hand.
I've put it in. I've written it in the chat box already.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. If you wouldn't mind just muting, I'll get to your question in just a moment. We've got a bit of a queue. Thanks so much, Jakob. It's good to see you here. So Lisa Hill was the first one to put a question in the chat quite a while ago. So I think we'll ask Lisa to ask her question first. Thanks, Lisa.
Right. Well, I'm curious about Australian publishers hunting out the Australian writers who are writing in their own language. I'm thinking of the example of Shakufa Azar and her Enlightenment of the Green Gage Tree. I think the only other book I had read prior to coming across that one was published in the 1970s by an Italian woman in Sydney, an Italian migrant, the name of which escapes him, Rosa Capiello. And, you know, we're such a multicultural nation, hundreds of different languages spoken here. And I'm sure they all have stories to tell, and they may even be writing them, but we readers don't see them anywhere. So I wondered, you know, is there any effort? No, that sounds rude. But I mean, obviously publishers must be aware of this. Is there anything they can do to encourage that kind of writing and publishing?
In terms of encouraging it, I mean, yeah, I guess it's a time thing. We do our very best to say and you know, text is one of the few, you know, amongst the, I mean, a lot of the big publishers don't accept unsolicited manuscripts, but we do accept unsolicited manuscripts, and we go through them every week, and there are thousands, I can tell you. It's called the slush pile. And some of them are books written, translated from original languages. But yeah, No Friend, the Mountain, that was one, written here. That's another example, and I really applaud that. I think that's and I think it will happen more and more now. But in terms of our efforts of we need people to bring them to our attention. We can't we can't find everything, but more than welcome to receive submissions. Yeah,
it just shouldn't be as unusual as it is.
I totally agree. I really agree.
Thank you.
I mentioned that multicultural in the beginning. I think it's really important, and the First Nations languages.
There have been a few bilingual publications by Indigenous writers.
Yes.
Published mainly by the Association for Indigenous Writing or something like that in Sydney, I think. But they're rare as well. Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. We'll jump on to the next question. Peter has a question. What proportion of translated texts are sold as ebooks?
We sell all our books as ebooks.
That's interesting. Yeah. And Felicity, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. What proportion of translations done in Australia are from other languages into English, and what proportion into other languages?
So the question was, I'll just repeat it because the connection was not so good.
Sorry. Okay.
What is the proportion of translations into English and into languages other than English done in Australia? So is it sort of more or less a balanced kind of equation, or are there more translations done from other languages into English or from English into other languages?
I don't have the statistics for all of Australian publishing at all, but I would imagine probably more into English.
More into English, yeah. Interesting. And the text experience, like the actual text experience, would you say that you are selling more books for translation or translating more yourself? Sorry, trick question.
Sorry, I'm really good with words, but I'm not very good with statistics. And I can just hear the rest of text going, because sometimes I'll be known to say, no, is that the print run or is that the advance? You know, like I'm just not great. So I don't want to give any statistics. I can get back to you with that, and I'm more than happy to do that. But
you have so many other qualities, Penny. Just let that one go.
Thank you very much.
So Joachim, over to you now, please, your question.
How do you arrange for translation quality checks when there's nobody in the press who speaks the source language? It's often necessary to check translation quality?
We can't do that. We can't tell the press what to think and say. No, we have had some strange reviews over the years, yeah. But we're hoping that people are more and more educated about translation and can do some of their own research. But obviously, if the reviewer comes back to us with questions, we can answer them. But it's a tricky situation because we can only give them the book and hope that we get a review, but which is already a difficult proposition. But we can't tell them how to vet the translation. No.
Mm. Yeah, it's a vexed situation there, isn't it? But I suppose in some ways, I suppose the proof of it is in the reception, isn't it? Of the work and the reviews that you do receive. Hélène Jacomar has a wonderful question that I would have asked myself had I taken the floor. What was your big break in translating, Penny?
Oh, I had translated a fair bit of other medical things over the years, and I worked at Scripsy, which was a literary magazine that existed through Melbourne Uni for a long time, and I did a lot of translation there. The obscure French criticism, Gérard Genette, and I didn't dare translate poetry by myself because I think that's a really tricky thing. I've had conversations with the wonderful Julie Rose about this, but I worked with a poet, John A. Scott, and translated a lot of French poetry. And then it was, Marie Darrieussecq, discovering her writing, really. That was the thing that, I just desperate to translate her. But I had always been translating on and off,
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? How many languages do you read? Is it French?
Well, as I said, I read French and Italian, and I can read. I did a quick course in Spanish to be able to take my daughter to Spain, and then I thought, no, she's the one who speaks Spanish. I'll let her speak Spanish. And I did. I can understand German, so But
it's clearly an asset in your serendipitous choices as well. It's fantastic. Lilith has a question. There we are, Lilith.
Yeah. Yes, Penny, I was just wondering how often you publishers actually get to pick the translator, and how often are you told X will be the translator?
Look, sometimes it's a discussion, but because we're the smallest of the English language markets in a bigger deal like that, it's tricky because like Jan Jankes had a few different translators, but now, we didn't get to pick the current translator because Grove in the US is the biggest, so I mean, it's every book is different in terms of picking the translator. You can make suggestions. It depends on your relationship with the editor and the other publishing companies. And I mean, I get on really well with pretty much all of them, but sometimes the agent gets in the way. Sorry. Keep forgetting this is being recorded, but kind of silence, it's not there isn't a particular process that one follows. It's a discussion.
Thank you.
Really interesting. And Amy's got a question as well. Would you like to ask your question, Amy? Amy Castle? Oh, no, sorry, Amy has a swollen tooth. So she's asked a question for Penny. In this age of information overload and social media mania, how vast is the market for literary translation?
Well, I mean, I think I said, with COVID, it's difficult in terms of, the finances of buying and selling rights. But I think that equally people are much more open now to books in translation than they were, 20 years ago or so. whether it's that hunger for, because we're all, you know, cooped up in our country, that, you know, we want to understand other cultures. So, I mean, social media does help. It really does help to spread the word about our books. So it's, you know, but probably more and more we're talking about themes of books, whereas in the old days it used to be more about the quality of the writing. So if you've got a really cool theme to your book that's in translation, you're more likely to be able to sell it. So, you know, women also, you know, it depends on fashion a lot.
Yes. Yeah, it's fascinating. And of course, you know, fashion, social media, they're all moving along a pace together, and obviously a huge inter exchange between the two. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to finish this session now, and we are very, very grateful to you, Penny, for answering these questions so generously and for presenting just a tiny part, I think, of your experience as a publisher and a translator and an editor. And, you know, I want to ask the final question, because the theme of our symposium is writing, translating and publishing. Is there a novel in Penny Houston?
A novel?
Writing. We've got some fantastic sessions this afternoon on writing writers who also translate. Is there a novel in Penny Houston, do you think?
Oh, I mean,
I think there is.
I've got lots of good stories, but you know, sometimes with publishers, you know, you're reading so much and you end up thinking, God, there's too much bad literature out there. I don't want to contribute to it. But yeah, right now I'm sort of with Jennifer Croft. You know, every word that we translate, it's, you know, there are words, and that's enough for me right now. Yeah.
Fair enough. Good answer. But I'll still be looking out for your novel. Thank you so much, Penny.
Thank you.
A round of applause for Penny. Thank you really so much for bringing your knowledge and experience to this session, to this symposium. And we're all very, very grateful to you for your participation. So thank you again.
Thank you to everyone.
We'll move on to the next session, which will be chaired by Dr. Lilith Thwaites, who is an award-winning Melbourne-based literary translator from Spanish to English. And she's also an interviewer, moderator, commentator, lecturer, and academic researcher on contemporary Spanish literatures and cultures. She is going to chair a panel on the Australian writer and translator's publishing and research experiences. So over to you, Lilith.
Thank you very much. And welcome to all the participants. This session, panel session, is on the topic of Australian writer-translators, publishing and research experience, and it features 3 published writers and translators: Bridget Marr, Tiffany Tsao, and Elizabeth Breyer. Bridget, for those of you who don't know, translates from Italian to English, Tiffany from Indonesian to English, and Elizabeth from Spanish to English. I'll introduce each of them individually before they give their 15 to 20-minute presentations, and the presentations will then be followed again by a Q&A session. So you can put your questions in the chat room, as Jackie has already explained, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible in the time we have. Also, just as a promotion for our writer translators, information is being provided in the chat about each participant's website and books, with an indication of where their books can be purchased. Given that this year there's no opportunity for us to actually sell the books during the break between sessions, I urge all of you to check out their websites and the websites of all of our participants at your earliest opportunity. And now, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Bridget Marr. Bridget joined Italian Studies at La Trobe University at the start of 2010. For her PhD in Translation Studies at Monash, she investigated the translation of humour, irony, satire, Parody and the Grotesque in Italian and English Literature. This work was subsequently published in her book, Recreation and Style, Translating Humorous Literature in Italian and English. In addition to continuing her work on humour and its translation, she's currently undertaking research related to Italian contemporary literature, transnational literature, the circulation and translation of crime fiction, and the role of translation in English in language teaching. Bridget's also an associate editor, or has been in the past, at various journals, and as some of you will no doubt know, was also for a time president of AALITRA. Perhaps more to the point for our purposes here today, Bridget is also a literary translator. Her translations into English of novels by Milena Agus and by Nicola Lagoya have been published in Australia, the UK, and Italy. Her translation of Salvatore Striano's prison memoir, La Tempesta di Sassa, Set Me Free, has been published by Text. Through her translation work and her research activity, Bridget seeks to bridge the gap between theory and practice in the field of translation studies. Her topic today, Bridget, is literary translations into English, publishing and research experiences. So over to you, Bridget.
Thanks, Lilith. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see my little PowerPoint. It's pretty simple. So yes, I wanted to give a little bit of a picture of literary translation in contemporary Australia, which hopefully will complement what the other speakers are saying, and hopefully I'll try not to overlap too much. But this is based on a study I did last year. By literary translation, I mean translation of poetry, prose of various kinds, fiction, literary histories, biographies, theatre also, translated for publication by established publishing houses. So not so much things that we might do for pleasure, but things that actually, as well as being a pleasure, come out and are published by established publishing houses. And in order to get this picture, I interviewed a number of translators based in Australia and a few publishers as well. I found in preparing this study that I was doing, which incidentally is coming out soon in a book with that cover, although it won't be that blurry, Translating and Interpreting in Australia and New Zealand, Distance and Diversity, which is edited by our colleagues Judy Wakabayashi and Minako Hagen. And for this study that I did for my contribution, I found that there hadn't really been very much systematic research on literary translation in Australia, or on the contribution of who literary translators are, who's doing the work in Australia. So my focus is on their voices and experiences. It's based on some interviews I undertook last year between about May and July 2020 with 11 literary translators who, they weren't necessarily Australian, but they were based in Australia, or had been based in Australia for many years. And I also, a few months later, in October of last year, interviewed 4 representatives from some important independent Australian publishing houses that commission and or buy in translators. So the people, so the people publishing translators. The translators I spoke to were from a range of languages and professional backgrounds. There were 8 translating from European languages, 3 from Asian languages. I only looked at translation into English because I was looking at that. Well, that was what I was looking at. And they're from those translators, a range of professional and personal backgrounds. Some, 3 or so, were heritage speakers of the language they translate from, but most came, like I, for example, came to translation through some other route, through study, through happenstance or whatever. And the source texts that they translate come from Europe, Asia, and the Americas. So again, not an absolutely exhaustive range, but I think a fairly representative range of the kind of translation that's taking place in Australia. I should say, though, that the publishing of these translations wasn't necessarily only by Australian publishers. So translators based in Australia, some work with local publishing houses like Text and Scribe and Giramondo, but others work with international publishing houses that are based in other parts of the world. So one of the things I wanted to speak to the translators about was Australia's translation culture. As I said, these are people who are based predominantly in Australia, but that all of us really have international networks. And as I said, the Australian publishing houses don't only work with Australian publishers and Australian translators, and Australian translators don't only work with Australian publishing houses. So it's a very international market, but I focused on people primarily based in Australia. though often with the long-standing and long-term connections with the country whose language they translate. So to share with you some of the quotes, some of the things that people said to me. This first one is actually a publisher, an Australian publisher, who said this to me. A lot of what I share today will be quotes from these interviews. I don't see why only the British and the Americans should buy the rights to foreign titles. We should cultivate a culture of translation here. It's important our publishing culture in Australia can reach out and make publishing translations a normal and habitual part of the fabric. From the translator's point of view, on whether and what sort of shape a translation culture in Australia might have, people did make comments that we're all a bit scattered across the country, not scattered in our heads, hopefully, but scattered across the country. It's hard to connect. Translation is such a solitary pursuit, someone said to me, and translators only rarely come out of their hidey holes. Today, perhaps, is one of those occasions where a few of us are out of our hidey holes. There are, of course, plenty of outlets where translation is discussed, whether it's on ABC Radio National, it's on blogs, international and local, on podcasts. Other areas in which here in Australia we get to discuss and present translations is events organised by diplomatic missions and cultural institutes, public lectures, writers' festivals. But I was really happy to hear that Penny had some good news stories there, but it can be quite difficult, and a few people spoke to me about this, to get writers' festivals to really meaningfully engage with translation, and particularly with overseas writers that don't speak English well enough that they're willing to talk about their work in English rather than in the language they actually write with, and then have the assistance of an interpreter. So I hope that will change. One of the areas that translators talked about and sort of called for was really strong representation by a professional association, and compared to certain other countries, they felt that that was something that we really need to build here. So I'm so happy to see that, you know, and perhaps it's the draft of my chapter had something to do with this, but I know that people in AALITRA have been working towards this for years or anyway. But I'm really happy to see AALITRA's online database coming out, because I think that will be so beneficial for translators, but also for publishers, because when I spoke to publishers, they told me about how much serendipity is involved in what they actually translate, and what works they get access to, and what contacts they have, and what languages they have readers for. So I think that's going to be a really exciting development. Another area I looked at with my translators and the translators and the publishers I interviewed was how and if we can make translation more visible or more viable, and whether we want to and how we do that. So there are a number of awards, including, for example, the New South Wales Premier's Translation Prize, the Academy of the Humanities Medal for Excellence in Translation, which our own Penny Houston won very recently. And those are very prestigious and important awards. There are also some smaller ones like the AALITRA Translation Awards, and some that kind of come and go. Perhaps something we could all go back to our premiers if we're not from New South Wales. I don't think New South Wales has a premier, but if we're not from New South Wales, we could perhaps start campaigning our premiers for more translation prizes. Victoria used to have one, but that was discontinued in about 2000. So it would be great if we started to get some more premiers translation prizes up and running. But that New South Wales one is certainly a very important one. I won't go into it because it already came up, but a couple of translated works have recently been nominated for and or won important mainstream literary prizes, by which I mean prizes that weren't focused on translation. And I'm referring specifically to Şükufə Yazar and Beruş Buchani's works, both translated from Persian. So they have sort of been taken on as works of Australian literature, although they weren't first written in English. So that's very exciting. But as we know, and this was already discussed in the last session, so I won't go into it anymore, there is such a strong multilingual capacity in Australia that's largely going untapped when it comes to works being circulated in publication, in translation. And that's one reason I'm certainly looking forward to this afternoon's session with Nadia and the Australian Multilingual Writing Project, because I think we have so much potential there. And that's going to be exciting to hear some more about that. Another interesting development is another really important part of making translation financially viable for translators is foreign government financial incentives. So a lot of overseas governments offer subventions for translations. One of the publishers I spoke to said, this is quite an amusing quote, I find, translations, to the extent that they're funded by the originating government, can be an area where you can't lose too much money. which I think is perhaps indicative of how the modest sort of expectations translators, publishers sometimes have to have of the work that they publish in translation, perhaps more because they believe in it than because they think it's going to be a massive money spinner. But one thing that really helps them are those foreign government financial incentives, and a number of overseas governments offer those, many of the major Western languages, also Chinese, Japanese and Korean. And so that's really important where that's available. But also very exciting is the Australia Council's Translation Fund for Literature, which is a recent innovation. Another publisher described this as an extraordinary step in relation to the parochialism of the Australia Council in the past. So that's very positive, because it does mean that translations by Australian translators are being seen as something that is part of Australian literary culture and something that the Australia Council could contribute to facilitating. One of the publishers, that I spoke to actually cited this Australia Council Translation Fund as the reason why they had begun putting the translator's name on the front cover of their books, which also fits in neatly with what we were saying before about Jennifer Croft and what Penny was talking about. So I think that's just indicative of how, just a little bit more recognition and visibility sort of makes people, even publishers that perhaps previously hadn't thought about that, makes them start to consider that. Another one of the publishers I spoke to hadn't really thought about it before, but when I mentioned it, said, I guess the name should be on the front. You're effectively a co-author. But I think that publisher or that editor hadn't really thought about it until I brought it up. So hopefully more translators' names will appear on the front covers of books. I think I've translated 7 or 8 books and I've only appeared on the front cover of the latest one, which was with Text. So thank you, Text. I'm glad that you guys have made that policy change. Another publishing house I spoke to actually gave me told an interesting story about one particular young adult text where the sales team felt quite strongly that putting the translator's name on the cover might make it look less accessible. And so they actually opted not to put the translator's name on the cover of that book. Unfortunate, obviously, for that translator. I guess, though, it's a reminder for us all that there are a number of agents involved, and I don't just mean literary agents, but all kinds of agents, all kinds of parties involved in the publication text, not just the editor, not just the translator, not just the author, but also people like sales teams who have their own ideas, perhaps preconceptions about what readers want. A lot of the interviewees I spoke to, the translators I spoke to, do a number of other jobs. So that was another part of the picture, I suppose, of literary translation in Australia. It's very much a part-time activity for many of us. Only one of the interviewees I spoke to self-described as, quote, the only one in Australia stupid enough to be doing this full-time. That's someone who makes a living exclusively from literary and scholarly translation. But there's a lot of diversification in the field, and most of us do a bunch of other things. This is probably in part because there's a relatively low demand for translation into English. The pay and conditions aren't fantastic, so it can be quite hard to make a living from it. But I sort of, perhaps because I'm just fairly optimistic person, I think we can see it as a strength as well, because it does mean that literary translators as individuals, we're visible in lots of different roles, a range of roles in the community, in the wider intellectual and literary community. So we're able to draw attention not only to our specific publications, but also to the work of translation in other settings, I suppose. So a lot of
2 minutes, Bridget.
Yeah, how many? Sorry,
2.
2? Yeah, no worries. So there's a lot of translators involved in teaching and research, in technical translation, in writing afterwards and notes and articles and so forth, in editing, in creative writing projects, and that's where Liz and Tiffany are particularly interesting figures, because as well as being great translators, they're great writers as well. I can talk very briefly about editing if you, about Australian English, if only just to say that some of the translators I spoke to really feel that they quite are happy to, particularly in dialogue among characters, for example, quite happy to have traces of their Australian English come through. Others find that they work a lot with American editors or with other overseas editors who pick up things that even when the translator was quite sure that they were avoiding their Australian English traits, somehow seem to creep through. I know that's happened to me as well. Anthony Pym has noted this wasn't in an interview, this was just a quote in something he wrote, a peculiar assumed convention that our target language should be as neutral as possible. And some of the translators I spoke to did feel that was the way they needed to translate, or what the editors they were working with at overseas publishing houses were looking for. David Colmer, another, again, this is not from an interview, but something he wrote about or spoke about, did note that it can be difficult to disentangle your language influences and not set off alarms, as he puts it, in readers from a different background. Because I guess, although we're global citizens, we all learned our English in one particular place and use it in one or more places, but those traces will come through in our translations. Okay, I had a couple more points, but I can probably, I think, leave it at that, because other points have been made about editing. But I will just say that the translators I spoke to were very positive about the editing process. Some had horror stories, but most of them were very positive about it. This is a very nice quote here from a publisher. There are many, many more great writers than there are great translators. And it requires a very special skill set to become an extremely good translator, and a very special skill set to edit translation as well. So perhaps I'll end on that. And thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. I'm sure that's raised a whole lot of possible questions and ideas, and they'll probably come up in the question session later on. So given that we're under pretty strict time rules here, I'll move on to our next speaker, who is Tiffany Tsao. Sorry, I'll just get my information up here. Tiffany is a writer and a literary translator. She's the author of the novel The Majesties, originally published in Australia as Under Your Wings, and long-listed for the 2019 Ned Kelly Award, and also for the Odd Fits fantasy series. Her translations from Indonesian to English include D. Lestari's novel Paper Boats, Laxmi Pamuncak's The Birdwoman's Palette, and Norman Erickson Pasaribu's poetry collection Sergius Seeks Bacchus, which was shortlisted for the New South Wales Premier's Translation Prize and has been awarded the English Pen Translates and the Pen Presents prizes. Tiffany was born in the United States of Chinese Indonesian descent. Her family returned to Southeast Asia when she was 3 years old. She then spent her formative years in Singapore and Indonesia before moving to the US for the university, and now finally she's back in Australia living in Sydney. Just on a personal note, I strongly recommend that people check out Tiffany's webpage among all the others that you're going to check out, which includes, among other items, a really powerful essay memoir on her own encounters with Norman Erickson Pasaribu. Today, Tiffany will talk to us about thinking bigger, how translators can help widen the reach of their works. So over to you, Tiffany.
Hi, so I'm encountering this issue where the more I do these online events, the worse I become at them. So I'd like to apologize in advance. I will also endeavor to share screen, because the events I've been to before have always had me send slides over, and they don't dare let us share our own screens. Very quickly though, I'm also just going to, there's a minor correction of the publishers list that was on the program that was sent out. Let's see, let's try and share this. Okay, it's probably not going to work.
If not, we might be able to get Jackie to do it.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to work, because for some reason, I think I was very manic with security and privacy, and then I put all my privacy settings on no, and now it's just biting me in the butt now. So I don't know, it's up to you, Jackie. Do you want to share screen? I sent you the slides. You might not have to. Also, oh, this will be fun. Alternatively, I printed out the slides. But seriously, they're actually just so that I don't just completely ramble on like I'm doing now. Okay, starting a timer so I don't ramble on. Okay, so I was going to talk about thinking bigger. and just about how translators can help widen the reach of their works. Because I think this is something that is that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And I think partly it does have to do also with my background as a writer, because I know that as a writer, right, it's like when your book isn't doing well or isn't getting reviewed, you're like, no, that's depressing. So then as a translator, I think I get very acutely conscious of trying to do my best for the works I translate as well. This talk is just coming from my own limited experiences in being a translator of Indonesian literature, working with publishers, but also I do work with an agent for most of my translated works as well. But it doesn't mean, unfortunately, that I get to hand it off to the agent. It means that I still do the work, and then my agent and I just end up strategizing a lot. Oh, thanks. Oh, that's great. Okay, sorry, Jackie. Is it okay if I tell you to click every once in a while? Is that all right? Sorry. Okay. Can you? Okay. So yes. So my main point, I guess, in this talk is to say that there's actually a lot that we translators, or at least I myself and many other translators, have to do besides translation, right? And there are opportunities throughout the process actually to ensure that, or to try to ensure that your works reach a wider audience. Because of course, there's only, you can try your best, but there's only so much you can do. Next slide, please. Oh, Lilith, are you clicking? Okay, see, so it's doing that. Okay, so anyway, what literary translators do. I guess I'd say that at first, I would have said that, that other little blue box there, translate. And that was, I would have said before becoming a translator, that must be what literary translators do. I'm sure many of you who are literary translators now know that actually that's not the whole picture, that actually there's a few other things that, that we can end up doing as well, depending, right? Maybe perhaps because I work with Indonesian as a language, in particular, I don't get publishers coming to me saying, we have this book, would you consider translating it? I very rarely have projects that I guess I bid for as a translator or apply for. What happens is that usually I just have to, I've at least had to start from the ground up. And how I got started in literary translation to begin with was for the Frankfurt Book Fair back in 2015, where Indonesia was the guest of honor there, or the focus. At the time, my agent, who actually represents my novels, my written work, said, oh, you're of Indonesian background. Do you have any, Indonesian writers you'd like to suggest? Because, now is the time. Publishers are like, let's publish some Indonesian writing. At that time, I had just started volunteering on the editorial staff of Asymptote, the online translation magazine. And I'd said like, oh, okay, well, let me have a think, and I'll come up with some ideas. So I put together sort of proposals and ideas for my agent essentially to sort of select from. And then I managed to sort of get the contact information, put her in touch with those authors as well. And out of that, I got two projects with Amazon Crossing. And Amazon Crossing, as I'm sure a lot of you know, they specialize in I guess, translated literature that is not necessarily high literary fiction. So they do that as well, but they also do commercial fiction and genre fiction, which is a nice, you wouldn't think it's a niche because it sounds really big, but it's actually, sort of a niche in its own right, because a lot of translations, when people think translation, a lot of publishers I've encountered anyway, tend to think like, oh, more, I guess, quote unquote, highbrow stuff. But there's like a lot of things that we as literary translators do, or I do, right? So, applying for grants, as Penny mentioned before, working with publicists, communicating, right, with the author and stuff. Sorry, this was all meant to be sort of staggered, and it was all supposed to appear one at a time in sort of a horrible cascade. Not horrible. I love what I do, but it is a lot of work. It is a lot of work, right? And so I guess I just want to, sort of remind people, right, that often, I realize is not always the case, but often, and in my case, and in the case of many translators of underrepresented literature, like literature from underrepresented languages, we can be involved from start to finish. And during this process, we have agency, or, a lot is required of us to do a lot of these things. So I think we do have, a responsibility and an interest also in making sure that the book goes as far as possible, right? As far as you can make it go. And there are ways throughout this process to try to ensure that your book reaches far and wide. Next slide, please. Okay, and so I think it is important to, start before the book publicity starts. From my experience, both, again, limited experience, and both as a writer and a translator, if you're only thinking about publicity after the book is out, I feel like it's a bit late. I'll never say it's too late, but right, I think that at that point, your abilities and options can be limited. So I think it's important to, start with good foundations and lay those good foundations first. And, some of them do have to do with, thinking about the stats or the, the qualities of the publishers, hopefully more than one, but, qualities of the publishers who are considering, picking up the book that you've pitched, or, the publishers that you do submit to just from the get-go. And, I think there are considerations that you can consider, right? Will people be able to buy the books easily? Not, all publishers have the same level of distribution and distribution capabilities. Do you see the books that they publish being reviewed, right? Sold in bookshops, talked about? Do they have experience publishing books like yours? Another thing is, for fit, right, which is a bit of a vague term, but it, maybe it's also can come down to, do you feel comfortable with them? I know for my writing, in any case, there was one publisher that was very interested in picking up the book. This was for my latest novel, Under Your Wings. And I ended up telling my agent that I would rather not have the book published than go with that publisher. And that was just simply because I looked at the backlist of the publisher and I felt very uncomfortable with other books about Asia that had been published. Some of them were sort of, I guess, sort of like Westerner sex adventures in Asia. And I just, was not comfortable with, having my book be marketed alongside there, or not knowing like how then they would see my book and treat my book. So, I think those are good things to think about as well, right? Because it depends, your publisher will be the one who is primarily like sort of publicizing the book. So it's good to think about whether you think they're a right home for the translation. I guess the other thing is, do think about the money. I have met translators who, for them, the money aspect is not important, partly because, as Bridget said, it's, it might be a part-time thing for them. So, or, they're not doing it for the money. And that is all well and good, but, I think the money aspect is important insofar as a publisher, how do I put it? I guess if, the more a publisher spends on your book, I'd say there is, more, it is a sign of how much, I guess they think your book will sell, but also there's more pressure to recoup, the outlay that they place. So I think, translators will take this also as good news, that actually advocating for a higher translator fee may help with the publisher being more on the ball about, okay, we spent this much money, so we should, maybe we really have to, think about, trying to sell the book now. Another aspect I would say or something I want to talk about regarding this is also, I represent at least one author who is from a working class background and who very much relies on the advances for these books, and they're very important to him. So it's not also a matter of, how much money I'm getting, but also I'm negotiating, and sort of thinking about his welfare as well in negotiating these things and helping my agent negotiate contracts as well. Another thing to think about is, thinking about English language world rights or world English rights, like Penny was talking about, or territorial rights. And, there's just, I'm not sure if there's, anything right one way or the other. I think there was a time when I thought like, oh, territorial rights are the way to go because you can parcel up the rights into like small sections and then sell them each for like, a little bundle of money. But recently, a lot of publishers have told me like world rights are non-negotiable or like very highly preferred. I guess my only issue with world rights is I've had one situation where a publisher did buy the world rights and then didn't end up, like my author had really wanted a publisher in North America, just because, just for an extra deal, I guess. This is the same publisher same author who has a bit of financial, in a bit of a financial situation right now. And so the fact that we didn't have that agency to do anything with the North American rights was a bit hard. So like all we could do is ask the publisher, hey publisher, are you doing, are you looking for a publisher on that side for this book? And they'd be like, yeah, oh, sorry, that seemed to have moved on. Can we go back a slide? Yeah, thanks. And that just ended up, I think we just felt like, we kind of wished we'd had the territorial, we just sold them the UK rights so that we could have a bit more of a hand in trying to find publishers in other territories. And I think it's also really important to compare notes with other literary translators because you will find out so much, I think, just in terms of, and most people are just happy to share, like with each other, the terms of their contract, how much they were paid, whether they got royalties as a translator, which, is usually from maybe, well, anywhere from 0 to 3%. The highest I've gotten paid as, for royalties. I haven't seen the okay, but anyway, 3% has been my highest translator royalty. The fees that you get, whether publishers are good to work with or not good to work with, that's also, stuff you can learn from other literary translators. So do talk. I think it's a good thing. Next slide, please. Okay, and this, I'll just sort of go through very quickly, but the joy of publicity. I think, what is it, Bridget mentioned that translators only come out of their hidey holes every now and then. I do feel like publicity is one of the things that I don't particularly like, but I also know it's important. And I think there are things that we as translators can do to help publicize works rather than just sort of sit back and let the publisher do it. And I think this is useful because this is how the landscape gets changed, right? This is how people start, taking notice of translations because the translators are out there, especially in cases where the author themselves doesn't, may not be able to publicize the work in the Anglosphere, right? So this is actually, in lieu of the author being able to appear at things, right? The translator can, or the translator and author can team up. So I, just say, get to know and work closely with your publisher's publicist once you have a publisher. Be their friend, don't harass them, because I think that like works maybe to your disadvantage. They have so many, they're usually snowed under too and have like a ton of things that they're trying to publicize. So I think it's just good to, sort of work in tandem as well, and stay positive, right? I think it's good to think about what you would like to write about. Like if you were translating a book and someone was like, what do you want to write about? What is the most interesting part of this? Or, how did you even come to want to translate this book? I think those are really nice to have up your sleeve because you can pitch these essays or pieces to, magazines, to websites, to, various outlets, right, where you can sort of, promote the book. And this helps. And this is actually an aspect that, I'd say is almost an advantage over what, just a normal written in English book would have. Because as a writer of my own books, right, there's only so much, I hate to say it, but like, I feel like it's like flooded with, people's minds are like flooded with like, oh, okay, the writer's talking about their book. But I've noticed that a translator is talking about an aspect of their translation or what it was like to translate, or the author, and people find that actually quite interesting. So I think that's, something that you can sort of think about and, start preparing even while you're, sort of looking for a publisher.
2 minutes, Tiffany.
Yeah, no worries. This is the last slide. I'd say it's also good to sort of publicize and make connections leading up to publication if you can. So, because no one likes to be that person. And this is how I always would feel. I'd feel like, oh, well, now I've published a book and now I'm going to promote it and tell people about it. But I feel like, like really annoying. like, oh, hello, have you heard about my book? But it's just good to make connections, beforehand and become friends with people so they don't just, think that you're like there to promote your book. And, you don't feel great either, right? Saying like, oh, the only reason I'm here and getting to know you is to promote this thing that I already have. So I think it's just good to, I hate to say it network, but network in, like a nice, friendly, like human manner. Because that's really like, networking at its ideal, I guess. Networking, kind of just like making friends. Reach out again to like various outlets about your book and maybe before that as well. And, just interact, use social media if you're comfortable with it. I don't want to push anyone onto social media because I feel like it's deeply unhealthy, even though I do it. But, when you're on there, I think it's also kind of good to sort of learn tips from people who are more social media savvy in our field. So it's, it can save you a great deal of heartache if you're like, spending an hour composing a tweet and then you send it and no one likes it. And then you're like, why am I doing this social media thing? It's awful. But actually, you can sort of like look and see like, oh, okay, this is, people are sort of, this is how people do things. They tag people, they whatever. And then you can sort of learn quite quickly from there and save yourself a lot of like heartache or depression. Because that's what life on social media is. And also if your author wants to be involved, work with them on promotional ideas. I think like I have one author who really likes to be involved, and we've had some wonderful, conversations that have been published in, various places, and people really like, that we have this author translator connection. And I think it gives them a chance also to be like, oh, my book is doing something cool and new in the Anglosphere, and if they want to be involved, I think that's a great thing. That's it for me for now.
Thank you, Tiffany. I think by the time we finish this session, there will be so many ideas for people to pursue, lots that I hadn't even thought of. So thank you for that presentation. Our final speaker is Elizabeth Breyer, writer and translator as well. Her debut novel, From Here on Monsters, was joint winner of the 2020 Norma K. Hemming Award. The novels, sorry, I'm going to put my thing up again. The novels she has translated from Spanish include Alexandra Lund's The Palimpsest, awarded a Penheim Translation Fund grant from PEN America in 2017. Claudia Salazar Jimenez's America's prize-winning Blood of the Dawn, and José Luis de Juan's Napoleon's Beekeeper. Her most recent translation is Maria José Ferrada's How to Order the Universe, published in February this year, and she herself is currently working on her second novel. Elizabeth divides her time between Biraranga, Melbourne, on unceded sovereign Wurundjeri land, and Arequipa, Peru. She has a number of links on her website to interviews about writing and translating, among other items. So again, do visit her website and buy her books. The title of Elizabeth's talk is Pitching to Publishers. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thanks so much. And thanks for having me here today. I feel like that was such an incredible overview from both Bridget and Tiffany, and I feel like I'm going to be repeating some things. So hopefully it serves as reinforcement and is not too annoying. So I am going to make some assumptions today, and I know that this won't describe everyone here, but I think it's probably where my experience can help the most. So I'm going to assume that you've already fallen for a book in a language other than English, that you have contacted the author or agent and have their blessing to try to find a good home for it in English, always knowing that finding a home for it may not necessarily mean you get to translate it. Hopefully you will, but that may not be the case. So in other words, that what you need to do now is to pitch. Like many of you, my published translations have been the result of a mix of pitching or taking the work to the publisher and catching. So translating a sample of a book for the publisher and then being chosen to translate the work based on the strength of that sample. So in the 5 years that I've been publishing literary translations, I've heard of very few translators catching a novel as their first publication. And I think Bridget actually is an exception. So maybe if in questions you want to ask her about that, fire away. But most of those who I have heard about double as in-house editors. So they actually had that relationship with the publisher because they're an editor. The opportunity arose for whatever reason, and that was how they first got into translation. So I do think pitching is a really useful skill to have, especially when we're starting out, as I am still. If you have questions about catching, and I will refer to it a little bit throughout, but please be sure to ask us later. First of all, I'm not going to go into too many of the technical details because I feel like it can feel like quite an information overload, but I highly recommend this resource that I'm putting in the chat. So that's by Chantal Wright, a literary translator and academic, and she translates from German and is based in the UK. So she demystifies the whole process. I found it really helpful to understand how to kind of do this process of getting a translation published. And she goes through all the kinds of things you can do prior to pitching, like getting your translations published in literary mags, all the kinds of ways to do that. So I highly recommend that resource. So you believe a work should be published in English, that readers in Australia or elsewhere in the English-speaking world need to read this book. So what now? How to attract a publisher's interest? I'm going to go through a few of my guiding principles when trying to find a home for a work. So principle number 1, and it may sound a little obvious, but know thy publisher. I need to remind myself of this all the time. Because it's about reading their books, of course, but not just their translated books. I think it's really important to read other of their books as well. And in saying this, I don't mean that you need to read every single book that publisher has brought out. So definitely be guided by your own tastes, because it's about finding where the points are that your own tastes and the publisher's tastes overlap. And it also helps when it comes to pitching, because it means you can say, okay, this book will be good for readers of X, Y, and Z for these reasons. So it shows that you're familiar with their list, and but it also helps you because it helps you find a good home for that work, because they are potentially already tapped into those readers. So they're already able to go straight to them when they publish your translation. I think it's also a really good idea to subscribe to the newsletters, read any interviews that editors have done. That can be really key, I think, because it can give little clues as to what kinds of things that editor likes personally. And it's always really great if you can grab someone's attention because they like something personally, not just because they think, okay, it'll be good for the publisher that they work for. And yeah, in this way you can kind of develop a feel for what kind of literature they seem to like. And as I said, the places where your tastes and theirs overlap in that sort of Venn diagram of favourite books. There is a caveat though, and that's that I do think it's important to be prepared to be surprised by what they do ultimately like. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But yeah, it's still good to establish what you think they will. My principle number 2 is only Australia with a question mark. So I would encourage you to research overseas publishers. By all means publish the wonderful, wonderful publishers we have here in Australia. But it might be worth trying the UK and North America publishers as well. And I think Penny hinted at this in her talk, if I didn't misunderstand. It's not just because of the smaller pool of publishers and the greater constraints on their bottom line that exist in Australia, because of how dispersed our population is geographically. You know, there's a huge cost for distribution, for example, so it can make publishing extra tricky in Australia. It's also because of the way that I understand that rights sales work, and I'm not an expert. But several indie Australian publishers have a higher than average portion of translated literature, as Penny also mentioned, so Text, Giramondo, Scribe, Black Ink, to name a few. But some of those titles are buy-ins. So that means a translation that usually a UK or US publisher has already published or is simultaneously publishing, but is the lead publisher for. So that publisher overseas, even though the translation's coming out here in Australia, is making those decisions, or perhaps has more power to make those decisions about who gets to translate. So, you know, it is a good idea to not just look to Australia, I think, when you're trying to place a text or a translation. So of the 8 books that I've translated or am in the process of translating, only one of these was with an Australian publisher, and that was José Luis de Juan's Napoleon's Beekeeper with Giramondo. So that is not necessarily reflective of everyone's experience, and I'm sure there are plenty of you in the audience who have not had that experience, but I do think it's a way to find a home for works that may not necessarily find a home here, or at least not as a first port of call. Principle number 3, be open to wherever pitching may lead. And this is a little bit woo-woo, I guess, this principle of mine, but I think it really helps to keep an open mind. This is about doing the work, doing that hustle, but also knowing that this may mean that opportunities may drop in for elsewhere. And so to return to that, that differentiation I was making between pitching and catching. So of the books I've translated, books by 2 of the authors have been purely caught. So there was no pitching involved. And the opportunity to submit a sample of this work of commercial fiction, of both of those works of commercial fiction, stemmed from the first book that I published. So that first book was this, very literary. It was a sort of episodic, impressionistic novella about the experience of 3 women during the Shining Path insurgency in Peru. So very specific kind of niche literary novella. And yet it led to these 2 commercial titles, to translating them. And the reason that happened was because in the process, so that author of that first book, she won a prize. That then attracted an agent. So then the agent, I really didn't speak to the agent, but the agent knew that that then, we'd found, the author and I had found this publisher, so they're sort of peripherally involved because they came on board a little bit later. But then that agent obviously represents other people, and so that agent needed a sample really fast, a paid sample, of course, and they sort of reached out and said, hey, could you do a sample really quickly? We're trying to sell the rights, we're having an auction and we need it right away. And so they didn't let me know, but they asked for other samples as well. So I know that the publisher that bought that work, they they read at least 3 different samples, and potentially they asked for more. But they picked me to translate the work because of that sample. And so this is what I mean by being open to wherever pitching may lead. I pitched a completely different book, and not even to this publisher, but through those sort of relationships that then happen even when you're not aware of them, you know, other opportunities can arise. And to give you one other example, there was an editor at a US publisher called Godin, which I wasn't familiar with, but they loved a sample they'd seen of Maria Jose Ferrara's How to Order the Universe, which was the book Lilith mentioned that came out earlier this year, and it came out with Tin House Books, so a different publisher. So an editor there at Godin really loved that work, but it wasn't right for the publisher that she was working for. So she had a personal sort of reaction to it. The publisher was much more kind of modernist focused, and it just wasn't a good fit. So she asked the agent who had done that sample, and she reached out to me, and her words were, and I share these because I know I've been guilty, especially with the first book, of thinking, oh, I'll do a sample. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because, you know, well, I wasn't getting paid to do it. I was looking for a publisher for this author, and it wasn't a paid job until I found a publisher. So, you know, I did a good enough job, but it is really important to do as good a job as we are able, because this editor said to me that often when she's reading samples, she can't tell whether there's a poor quality of the translation or a poor quality of the original work. So she has trouble trying to untangle that, and then I guess will turn down the work for that reason. So I'm just saying that, you know, it is really important that we do, that we get other people to read our samples, that we ask for feedback. It's not, of course, it's not published. So yes, we will have a lot of opportunity to make it better before it is eventually published. But if we can do all we can to get it up to quality, that's really important. So she got in touch. She said that she really loved the book, really loved the work that I'd done, and did I have anything else? And I'd been awarded a Pen Heim for the palimpsest, which meant that I was given the funds to then translate the whole thing. But several years had gone by, and several publishers had requested to read it, and it hadn't yet found a home. So I'd sort of stopped actively looking. But this turned out to be the perfect book for that more modernist focused publisher. It's well, not even modernist focused, but I guess the publisher there really likes kind of European works. This is a very sort of Central European humor. It's kind of almost like a Vitor Gombrowicz farce. So that, again, I'd pitched it to other publishers had asked for it, but it was only when that editor, who had seen a completely different sample through an agent, it wasn't through me, got in touch, that it was published. So yes, being open to wherever those opportunities may come. How long do I have, Lilith? I'm sorry, I was meant to check the time just to know how.
You've got about 4 minutes.
4 minutes. Okay, very quickly over principle 4. Moving beyond pitching, I think it's a really great idea to ask for a sample edit of your sample translation. So once you get the opportunity to work on a translation, if possible, ask for a sample edit of the sample you have provided, because I think this really helps to get in tune with the editor to see where those expectations are, to see where, you know, my own blind spots are, but also where this editor's may be. It's not just about house style, it's about getting in tune with that editor. And it's also not about, you know, humbly saying, oh, okay, I'll do everything you say. It's really great to enter into dialogue. You're the expert in this other language, in this source text. So, you know, you can say what you need to say about certain decisions you've made, but potentially those decisions could be different and yet still be in line with your translation strategy. So I think it helps you iron out, okay, are these potential problems in these decisions? And if there are problems, how can we then translate them in a way that is still aligned with my translation strategy? Or how do I then explain to this editor why they're so important? So it helps both of you, I think, to get on the same page. Principle number 5, and this is my final principle, is about making your practice sustainable and building resilience. So sustainability, how to do the work on limited money in this precarious landscape. As Bridget mentioned, I think the only thing that I can work out is that another source of income is key. For me, it used to be in the form of professional translation. Now it's in the form of sessional language teaching. And on this note of finance, if you are lucky enough to be awarded a grant, so, you know, applying to grants is really important. And if you are awarded one, I think it's great to set some of the allocated time aside for all of those peripheral matters that will help the work find a home. So researching publishers, writing pitches, publishing short stories by the author in literary magazines, all of those things should have an allocation of time, I think, if we're going to survive financially. And as for building resilience, it can be so very disheartening when something comes between you and a project you love. Maybe you haven't been able to find a home for the wildest, most innovative piece of literature you've ever read. Maybe it does find a home, but the publisher decides to go with a different translator. Whatever the case may be, I think we translators know that what we do is an art, and that and we're putting ourselves online for our art and for a work of literature that we love means we can get hurt. As hard as it can be, I think it helps to remind ourselves of this, that we would be no good at this thing we call translation if we didn't care, that care that we have for it is part of what makes us good at it. So I think that helps when we're dealt a professional or a creative blow, even if the creative blow is just, you know, wanting this word instead of that word, and the editor just can't see eye to eye. And at such times, I think leaning on your translation community can help you pick yourself back up. So reach out to your support network. Of course, you're all here at AALITRA, but I also just wanted to drop in a few other networks that you can tap into. And I've got the names here as well. So there's if you're not aware, there's a Facebook group called Literary Translation. And you can also go there when you have queries. If a publisher has terms that you're not quite sure about and you really need to check with someone, these can be great places to go as well. Another is the Emerging Translators Network, ETN, which is in the UK, and that's a Gmail group. And the same thing with Emerging Literary Translators Network in the US. That's also through Gmail groups. So you can get, you know, a newsletter. You can sort of do it. You can get updates every day, or you can get updates once a week. But it's somewhere you can also ask questions. So that would be the final thing that I would encourage. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. Sorry, Tiffany, what am I saying? Elizabeth. It's just that Tiffany's right in the middle of my screen where my camera is. We've had, I guess, lots of information, suggestions, practical advice, even some questions that people could think, ask themselves. So now is your chance to ask questions of our 3 panelists. If you can either put them in the chat, or I'll try and it's a bit hard because there's so many screens with everybody on them. But if you want to put your hand up, I guess we'll try it that way too. So if I'm just trying to have a quick look to see if there are any already out there. Don't see any. A couple in the chat maybe. Let me see.
Can I just say something, Lilith, while you're doing that? I just really like the fact, Elizabeth, that you mentioned there, the slide that I didn't get to included a quote from one of the translators I spoke to about pitching, and this person sort of, the way they phrased it was, I learned the perils of doing something out of passion. I feel you end up caring too much and getting nothing in the return. In the end, you have to make money. And I really like the fact that you acknowledge that, but also that you find a way of sort of making us remember that the caring is what makes us good at translating. And yeah, there will be blows from time to time where you put in the caring and you maybe don't get paid for something, or you don't get the gig. But I guess that sort of attitude, I think, could help us get back on the horse and try again.
I wonder if I could ask a question of the three of you, I guess, and that is, to what extent your other career, whether as a writer, academic, working in the area, how those two meld and how they might support each other. Clearly, we've had some indications of how the knowledge of the publishing world might input there, but are there other areas that where you find it helpful, it overlaps?
Do you want to tell us who you'd like to start?
Oh, well, okay. Well, since you're chatting, go ahead.
Yeah, I've got my mic on. Well, I guess for me, it helps that because I study Italian literature as part of my research, and I work in translation studies, those sort of feed in quite nicely. I try to reflect on my translation process and all that I sort of learn about Italian literature in my other work helps feed into my translation. So that's one way, I suppose, for me. My teaching as well, particularly when I teach translation.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth?
Can you repeat that, please? I kind of just went, whew, finished. And
sorry, okay. Mutual support between you as a writer and you as a translator, things that might support one or other. So, how does your writing help your translating?
I think from a practical standpoint, they don't take away from each other in terms of how my day looks. Mm-hmm. So, I get a lot of joy creatively from translating, but whereas writing, I have to do it first thing in the morning. So I can do that first thing in the morning, and it means that I kind of can't write for the rest of the day in a way, but I don't think translation suffers when I don't do it first thing. So I can do them both at the same time, which is really nice. It's just in terms of the way that my day looks. When I get to do both in a day, which at the moment is not really happening. How they feed in, I guess, probably just in terms of having that creative sympathy with that text. Like, I feel like it's a really beautiful, when you're translating, it's such a beautiful way to get to be in dialogue with someone through a text. And I don't actually mean talking to the author. I just mean, being in dialogue with this author and then getting to recreate that experience interlingually. So that's really beautiful. Whereas I think writing is quite solitary. So you're in conversation with writers through writing, so through reading and then writing, but it's almost like one step beyond, as in further away. So it's still solitary. They're both solitary, but it's less solitary, I think, translating, which is nice. Mm-hmm. I'm sure Tiffany has some much more articulate things to say.
Oh, hardly. Just a lot of, what you just said, Elizabeth, I was just nodding a lot. Creative sympathy. Sometimes I almost feel like being a translator and writer is harder because I feel, it's exactly like what Elizabeth does. I can only write in the morning before anything else. And then if I start translating, that voice is in my head, so I can't write my own things anymore. And actually, it's even reached the point now where I just have to alternate projects. I can write and translate at the same time, work on two projects at the same time, but they go very slowly, as opposed to if I'm just focusing on translation and then just focusing on writing. Another hard thing has been, sorry, I know that you're like, oh, how does it help? But now I'm just talking about all the hard things. One of the hardest things has been also feeling this sort of tug of war from both sides. So friends who are writers or who prioritize writing will ask me, okay, you're doing that translation project, but are you doing your own writing? You need to do your own writing. And it's so hard to say, like, the translation is just as important for me as my writing, because they sort of view it as a sacrifice that I'm making, an unhealthy sacrifice. Oh, they're prioritizing someone else's work over their own. And it's really difficult to sort of make people understand that this is also just something that's very important to you. And then vice versa, right? My translator friends are like, oh yes, I know that Tiff's kind of a writer, but really she should be working on another translation. So I almost feel just completely inadequate on both sides of the coin. Sorry, very quickly, I just want to plug Elizabeth's book again, because Elizabeth, you said that you have signed copies at a special price on your website, and that you bought a whole bunch this year thinking that you would be there in person or at this event. So I feel like everyone should reward that initiative and go to her website and buy a book, because I have a copy that I got signed full price from readings in Melbourne, and I really liked it. So
it's a great book for anyone interested in translation as well.
Okay, now we've got a couple of questions from the other participants. The first one, before it disappears, hang on, is sorry, having trouble here moving my screen up. Okay, what do the speakers think about Amazon self-publishing? Does any of you have any views on that?
I can talk a bit about that, just because I've worked with Amazon as a publisher, which people often think meant I was self-published. So that was also a source of like, no, they actually are a publisher. But for self-publishing, I don't know, I thought about it a lot with my first novel. And, you know, I think the big issue is you have to do quite a lot in terms of publicizing it yourself. So it's not even just a matter of it's published, but then how does it get distributed? From, you know, friends who are self-published, their experiences with bookstores is not very friendly. And then it just sort of ends up being a vanity publication. I think the question is what you want out of publishing though, right? If you just want a published book that you can, you know, pass out to friends and you're just excited to have it in book form that looks nice, then I think, you know, that's also okay. But if you want the whole apparatus that goes with it, the fame, the fortune, the money, the sugar, you know, then, so I'm just kidding, there's really not that much of that. Then yeah, I think it's a bit harder because you have to really do quite a lot of legwork on your own.
Okay, I might, given that we have short time, move on to another question. Sorry, and that first one was from Kieran Tapsell. This one is from Jorge Salaver. Would you agree that Australian literary magazines are too reluctant to publish excerpts of translated works? Anybody like to venture that one?
I haven't had that experience. I have had the experience, and there may be some overlap, where they're reluctant to publish excerpts. So if you're seeking to publish a translated fiction, then yes, they would be reluctant to publish excerpts because there are so few spaces for short stories. And so what I would say is, if you were looking to get shorter pieces published in Australian literary magazines, would be to see if that author has a short story, or to just publish, I mean, if you're just trying to get your own name as a translator out there, to publish a different writer than the one that you're pitching to publishers, who does specialize in short stories, because of course not all novelists can write short stories.
Okay, I've just had a message from the president informing me that we must finish at 3:33, which according to my computer is now. So Lisa has had a question directly for Tiffany. Perhaps Lisa, you could just post it to Tiffany specifically, so that I can hand back over to Jacqueline right now. And thank our panelists again, please, on behalf of everyone.
Thank you so much, Lilith, for chairing that wonderful session. Thank you so much for your contributions, Tiffany, Bridget and Elizabeth. It was a fascinating panel. And the good news is that we will actually have a chance to discuss all of the panels today and have a real conversation at the end of the day if we keep to time. And so what I'm going to do now is post in the chat the program for this afternoon. We have a 10-minute break, a short break to jump up and down, grab something to drink, do a cartwheel, and then come back at 3:45 sharp. And we will then get into an amazing panel with Nadia Niaz, and then another one with some more publishers. And our closing panel will be all about a conversation between our presenters and our public today. And then we'll have a final vote of thanks from our Vice President, Rob Savage. So fantastic presentation so far in the first part of the symposium. I advise you all to just switch off your camera and switch off your microphone rather than quit the Zoom room. So if you want to do that, 10 minutes, I'll stop the recording and we'll be seeing you back to start at 3:45 sharp with those fantastic panels coming up. Thanks so much for all of the support this morning, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. See you soon.